Do you have depression? How does it affect you?
I personally do not have depression. However, I have had depressed episodes. They don't last more than a week or so. Normally I get over them very quickly, they're very brief. However, these episodes often leave me tired, irritable, and sometimes feeling a hollowness. I find myself disassociating in a way. I can't quite feel, not just emotionally, but physically. It's almost a disconnection from the body that you feel. Because this is what it is, it keeps me from focusing, and it makes going to work every day much harder, I can assure you. And then being at work is much harder because the physical aspects, you're feeling lethargic, you're tired, you just want to rest, and you have to keep pushing yourself and pushing yourself. And it's hard to recuperate from that because you're still going.
How has having depression changed you?
Having these episodes of depression, because I'm trying to go into clinical mental health counseling, I'm trying to help people with depression, as well as various other mental disorders, but I think that having these episodes myself have helped me understand more on a personal level and given me a better perspective. It's also helped me manage my self-care to prevent burnout from school and work, noticing these moods, noticing the changes in perception, how I'm feeling towards things, helps me understand that I need to stop and really take care of myself. It has also made me understand just what it is a client will most likely go through in the future. And I think that experience is going to help me to build coping skills in these individuals.
Do you think people with depression are treated differently?
Absolutely, I do. I do believe that people with depression are treated very differently. Working in a blue-collar job, which has nothing to do with the degree that I have, I can tell you from experience that most of my fellow employees and even some of the employers believe that depression is just an excuse to be lazy. The majority of these individuals are, of course, unaware of the issues involved with depression. A lot of that is due to the fact that they are not educated on the subject matter. The education that they have tends to be in business or a GED. They don't quite come into contact with depression enough. And those that do don't fully comprehend it because they've either not gone through it themselves or they have problems dealing with people with depression because they're quote-unquote downers. And I think with the complexity of depression and the mental illness in general, the population of underpaid workers don't really seem to care. A lot of it comes from ignoring their own feelings and trying not to feel depressed themselves. And because they don't want to fall into it, they basically treat people with depression very differently. They kind of stigmatize them. They kind of push them away a bit because they don't want that. They treat mental illness like they do a virus. They don't want to catch the depression. They don't want to catch the downs. So they stay away from people.
What are some of the stereotypes you've heard regarding depression?
I think the most telling stereotype that comes regarding depression is the idea that, depression is just another word for feeling bummed out. That depressed people would feel better if, you just pushed yourself, if you pulled yourself by your own bootstraps, if you did this, that, or the other, not really empathizing or even sympathizing, but just saying, get over it. I think that's the biggest stereotype, that people with depression just need to get over it, without the understanding that, of course, they cannot just get over it. There's so much more to it than that. I think the other stereotype, with depression is people with depression are just lazy. They're just using it as an excuse. Going back to what I said about my employers, most workplace environments now will cover therapy and taking time off for depression, because they understand that it really does affect your work, it affects your school, whatever you're in. It can take a toll. However, some managers are not so understanding of this. So they'll laugh off anyone who's using a mental health day as just not wanting to come in. You may as well have just called in sick. You're just using this as an excuse. And it's rather sad because if someone is truly experiencing something, they're basically saying that this person is a joke. And I think the stereotype that depression is just some long-winded joke is also another thing. that people with depression are the butt of a lot of jokes.
What would you like to tell people about having depression?
I'd like to tell people that having depression is completely normal. We oftentimes, as human beings, go through depressions, and it's various kinds of depression. Sometimes it'll last for months, sometimes it will only last for a few days, sometimes even a few hours. Anything can set off depression for anyone. I think that understanding that each person experiences it differently, although there are universal signs of depression, it doesn't mean that you're going to always have the same symptoms as someone else. For example, someone with depression might show symptoms of anxiety. In fact, in the DSM, there are different diagnoses that go with major depression. For example, as I mentioned earlier, anxiety, there's also dissociation, like what I tend to have with depression. So even within the DSM, there's an acknowledgement that there are numerous amounts of depression and various symptomatic behaviors that occur and symptomatic feelings that occur.
Why do you think there is this stigma around mental illness?
I believe the stigma around mental illness comes from a fear of the unknown. Because most people don't have the knowledge or don't know about what mental illness is, what it truly does, and the nuances that go with it, they don't understand it. Because they don't understand it, they make fun, or often enough, they'll just try to brush it off. They don't want to think too much about it, and I think that's the problem is, it's a complex issue. It's not simple. And for the masses, unfortunately, when something isn't simple, it's kind of difficult for them to get involved with. Furthermore, I really think that the media has not done a great job at portraying mental illness. A lot of the times you'll see someone with schizophrenia in a movie and they end up being some serial killer. And I can guarantee you that the majority of schizophrenics haven't hurt anyone. They're more liable to hurt themselves. And I think that these portrayals damage what it is to be mentally ill. And again, going back to what I mentioned earlier, because seeing how emotionally taxing it can be to handle someone with depression, people tend to avoid them because their viewpoints and perspectives while they're depressed may bring their mood down. And they don't want to handle that. They don't want to deal with that. So they avoid people with mental illnesses.
How do you feel about mental illness?
I feel that without better mental health education and a greater understanding from the populace, the stigma and fear surrounding mental illness will remain. I believe that at our core, humans can gain a greater understanding of one another, in which we can learn to coexist more fully with a grasp of the human mind. Understanding our needs and desires, understanding what someone who is mentally ill may be lacking, understanding what they may know, basically seeing things from other people's perspective, empathizing more with one another. By taking an issue such as depression and demystifying it for people, we move closer to that goal. And I feel that once we have demystified mental illness and the majority of people get a better understanding and educate themselves on it, they'll learn not only to help themselves when they need mental health care, to go to mental health professionals without fear or worry. For children and for teens, talking to their parents seriously about mental health issues, letting them know that they've got this going on without being afraid to talk to them about this, but by understanding that in a lot of ways mental illness is your own mind trying to protect you from something, almost to the point where it's lying to you about if you go to your parents the world will end. Understanding that it's not the truth, and it's just a perspective at a moment in time that will change eventually, I think we'll get more healthy individuals mentally and help cope with the people who are mentally ill now. We'll give them a way to empower themselves in a way that the media doesn't help with. In a way that, learning not to compare yourselves to some movie star that doesn't even know you. Just learning to be okay with being you and learning that your mental illness or anyone's mental illness doesn't define them. Being a human being and their actions and choices define them. But I think that we as a society have a big issue that we're, as counselors, fighting every day against, calling this is, so-and-so. she's depressed, instead of saying, here is an individual who just so happens to be depressed. We make it a label, and I think that if we get away from the label of depression, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, if we get away from the labels, we get closer to the understanding that people are dynamic and they need to be treated the same way as any other person. And that's with respect, and that's with a certain amount of love, particularly from family members and friends. And I think that mental illness on a whole will be much easier to discuss amongst regular folk. You know, at home, with your folks, with your friends. It's going to be something that as we continue forward, it will be much easier to discuss, particularly compared to where we were even 100 years ago, where we're still feeling the stigma of 100 years ago, of the shame having someone with mental illness brought upon a family, when in reality there should be no shame. There is no shame in asking for help.
Depression is not something to be feared.
It's complicated and hard to understand,
But we ask
that you keep your mind open.
To help end the stigma.
Just because someone has depression
doesn't mean that they're not like you.